My name is Robert Rapier. I'm a chemical engineer who writes a little bit. I live in Hawaii now. After growing up on a farm in Oklahoma, I really appreciate that year-long growing season. I've got more vegetables in my garden than I can possibly eat out there, which is a nice, I sometimes think I could feed myself in worst case out there. I don't grow as much as my friend Richard Ha, who's also here from Hawaii. He's one of the major food producers out on the island. Grows lots of the tomatoes that I eat. You know, I can go just about anywhere and give a talk about peak oil right off the top of my head because I think about this every day, but I'm in front of a group who also thinks about this every day. So I give a lot of thought to this talk and how not to preach to the choir, because I don't want to say things that you're going to hear several times, or that other people are going to say, or that you already know. So I gave a little bit of thought, and I wanted to come up with a couple of things that maybe others had not brought up, and maybe you don't hear a lot. And specifically on energy return on energy invested and carbon emissions, I want to make a couple of points there that maybe not commonly known. Okay, so global status report. You've heard this a lot. We've been on a plateau since about 2005. And the good news is we have managed to shave some of our consumption. And the bad news is it's mostly by crippling prices and recession, and demand from China and India more than made up for that. If you want to think about something scary, think about our oil consumption in the U.S. is 23 barrels per person and China's is 2. Now, imagine that we meet in the middle somewhere and we all end up using 8. That'll be devastating for us, and they can still grow their economy. And they can afford higher priced oil than we can because they're far less oil dependent than we are. So we're going to end up paying whatever China is willing to pay for oil, and it could be quite a bit higher than what we're paying right now. And of course, you know, I coined something a few years ago after Jim Kunstler's The Long Emergency, the long recession. How do you come out of recession when oil prices continue to hover around recession-inducing levels? And it's very difficult to imagine how we're going to have an easy transition out of this difficult economic times that we're in right now. So peak oil, in 2005, peak oil really entered the mainstream, and 6 years later, despite much higher prices, it continues to be ridiculed. You know, all these are headlines from the last month. You know, Jurgen debunks peak oil. The peak oil brigade, the peak oil pranksters, it's always something. Peak oil is nonsense. This is one of the reasons I don't even like to use the term peak oil. When I'm talking to people, I usually talk about resource depletion. That's less charged and less of a problem for me personally when I talk to people. So we talk about resource depletion. Peak oil, you know, I've never been one to try to hang a particular date on peak oil. I think in 2005 we were having a lot of discussions, and a lot of people said peak oil is now. I said, you know, it could be that it goes up a little bit, but despite that, we still have a problem. And I gave a lot of thought to this, but the problem is really there's just not enough supply to meet demand. And so I wrote an essay maybe 2006 where I talked about peak light, and peak light was that production could grow a little bit, but the spare capacity is being eaten up by demand in China, India, the developing world. And so you'll see peak oil problems even if we're not at a peak right now. Maybe production can go up another 500,000 barrels a day. The Energy Information Administration, if you follow their oil production, right now 2011 is running at a record rate. So we may see a record this year. The BP Statistical Review said 2010 was a record by just a fraction of a percentage, 0.7% or something. So I think it's important not to get hung up on the peak itself, but rather, you know, what is it fundamentally that's happening here? There's a world hungry for oil, and there's just not enough supply to meet that at the prices that we would like to pay. A friend recently said to me, the United States cannot afford $100 oil. I said, well, the problem is a lot of the world who doesn't use so much is gladly willing to pay more than $100. When you think about the energy embedded in oil and what it can do for their lives, they're happy to pay higher prices than that. And that's the price we're going to have to pay. So why aren't people concerned? this annoys me. I talk to people all the time, and they're certain there's a solution out there. They hear about these huge oil finds. People all the time ask me, isn't it true that the Bakken can make us energy independent? About oil shale, okay? Shale oil and oil shale. I'll talk a little bit about oil shale here. And I don't know if you meant oil shale or shale oil. You know, shale oil is the oil that you can derive from shale deposits. Oil shale is what we have 1 trillion barrels of in Utah and in the West. There's a headline from a newspaper in 1906 that says oil shale development is imminent. And here, 105 years later, it's still imminent because the energy required to pull out that 1 trillion barrels is more than 1 trillion barrels. And so you might as well be talking about mining one of the moons of Saturn for methane. It's there, but it's useless unless we could come up with technology that we can get it out at a better energy return. And of course, the public is really interested in Kim Kardashian, Lindsay Lohan, and the vampires from the Twilight series. One of those is Edward, I think. And the way I know that, because my wife and daughter are fanatics, and my wife has a pillowcase with his face on there, and I look at that every night. Every night before I go to bed, I see Edward. So, beware energy return on energy invested. I mean this in two different ways, and I'll make that clear. Okay, let me define a couple of terms. So, energy return on energy invested. You all have heard this term. Basically, it's the usable energy that we get out over the energy that we put in. So if we consume, let me make that clear, if we consume 1 BTU of energy to produce 2 BTUs of energy, then we have an energy return on energy invested of 2 to 1. So that's a very simplistic example. Globally, energy return on energy invested is declining. The very easy oil, as we progress to harder and harder oil into the oil sands and in deep water, the energy return on energy invested gets harder and harder. It takes more energy, more effort to get that oil out. So the good news is, as it declines, as it takes more and more effort to produce energy, it is going to take more people to create that energy. The bad news is, if you don't take away anything else, I want you to think about this curve. So I created this graphic because I'm trying to convey the point. So let's say the world needs 85 million barrels a day. So let's say that's what the demand is. So conventional oil has started out at like 100 to 1 energy return on energy invested. Currently, it's probably in the 9 to 10, maybe up to 15 range. So this is conventional oil. Tar sands, I've got a couple of independent confirmations that tar sands, just the extraction portion, is in the 6 to 8 range. Once you refine that into gasoline, you're down in around the 4 range. So tar sands is in this region. But if you look, so to get 85 million barrels a day at 10 to 1, we're producing still less than 100 million barrels of gross oil to net out 85 million barrels. And when you move down to the 4 to 5 range, you've taken a little bit more, but the line is fairly flat. If you go out to 20 to 1, it's not that much different than 10 to 1. But most biofuels are generously in that region right there. So let's assume that globally biofuels are in 2 to 1 range, and we need 85 million barrels of oil a day. That means that gross, we have to produce 170 million barrels. This is why the world will not run on biofuels. I've done some calculation. I did a book chapter for David Pimentel, and I did a calculation where I said, if we used all the arable land in the world and used that to make biofuels, how much could we actually produce? So I'm trying to set limits. If you used all the arable land that's available, you could only gross replace about 40% of the oil we use. So as you see here, where biofuels are running, you'd need 4 or 5 times that much. So, you know, Bob talked about the future being electric. It has to be electric if we're going to have any kind of mobility similar to what we have today. We will need some liquid fuels. You're not going to have electric airplanes. But to have the kind of mobility that we have today, and maybe that's not possible at all, but electric is the only possibility in the long run because we're not going to run on biofuels. The reason we can run on biofuels today is that's being enabled by very high EROEI sources, fossil fuels. That's what drives biofuels. If they had to run on their own production, the whole thing would fall apart. So I say beware of EROEI for two reasons. One is, as it declines, it's going to really be difficult to produce the energy we need. But the other is, sometimes we use this like a blunt instrument, and there are some caveats. And one of the most common ones is people don't care about energy return, they care about economics. And so you can say it is true that you might use 2 BTUs of coal to produce 1 BTU of ethanol. Now, EROEI is a measure of sustainability, because that says we're using the coal up even faster than if we maybe used it for something else, but it could be economical to do so. One of the biggest ones is there is no time component in EROEI. And by the way, Dave Murphy is going to talk about this a little bit later. I had several more slides where I actually showed examples of each one of these, of how these can break down. He's going to talk in more detail about that, and I think his slides call it EROI. I'd say maybe there's even another acronym. It should be annualized EROEI. And the reason is, think about a process that returns 2 to 1 versus one that returns 10 to 1. But the latter is on an annual basis and the former is on a daily basis. Well, the 2 to 1 in that case will beat the 10 to 1. So we can't say just bluntly a lower EROEI process will beat a higher EROEI process, because the time needs to be taken into consideration. Biomass inputs. Sugarcane ethanol is not really 8 to 1. That's a fossil ratio. They don't count the bagasse that they end up with. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a good economic system for them, but it's not a real EROEI. And inputs and consumed energy. Sometimes you hear people claim that the energy return for ethanol is better than for gasoline. The way they do that is they assume that the BTU of oil that they put in was consumed, when actually only a tiny fraction of it was consumed in the processing of the gasoline. So it's an apples and oranges comparison. The 0.8 is an efficiency for gasoline, where the 1.5, or pick your number, 1.3, 1.2, 1.9 is an actual energy return. The actual energy return for oil to gasoline is about 5 to 1. Okay. So people get upset when I talk about this. I wrote an essay on the oil drum, and for a long time it had the most comments of any essay there, until Gale finally wrote one that trumped it. But the essay was, "We will not stop global warming." And people get very upset about that, because they said, this is not helpful. And I said, I'm not trying to be unhelpful. I'm trying to make an observation. So our per capita CO2 emissions in the United States are there on the left, are 4 times the global average. So this is true. On a per capita basis, we do use a lot of energy. But the developing world has a whole lot more per capitas. So over the last 10 years, our emissions have actually declined, and the European Unions have actually declined, and in Asia Pacific, they have skyrocketed. In fact, China now emits, over the last 5 years, China has emitted more CO2 than we do. Now, a Gallup poll was done a few years ago where they polled Indians and they said, what do you think about global warming? And only 35% of them even knew what it was. So you've got a country that would like to develop and is developing, and most people have never even heard of global warming. In China, about 60% had heard of it, but only 20% thought there was a problem. So we've got a problem that's largely outside the United States that we don't really have a good handle on. We don't have a good way to control that. Even if the EU and the United States emissions went to 0, it would only take us back to the mid-90s levels, and it would still be greatly increasing. So in order to get this problem under control, somehow we have to ask people who use only a fraction of the per capita energy we use to use less, or to stop developing. And some people say, well, the United States can lead the way by developing clean energy. Again, we're not in much of a position to lead the way. When we use as much as we use, it's hard to provide an example for them. So, changes in CO2 emissions 2000 to 2010. The developed world is on the right. That's the EU and United States, most of the developed world. And the rest of the developing world is rapidly increasing their CO2 emissions. So when we talk about what will happen, I believe, is we will hit that tipping point of 450 ppm that was talked about yesterday. And the best we can hope for is that the consequences are not as severe as some people predict. I've likened it to a hurricane before. I can see the hurricane coming in and I can fret that the hurricane is going to do a lot of damage. One thing I can't do is stop the hurricane. And so it's very difficult for me to see how we stop the developing world from emitting so much. Jeff Rubin had a very good idea in his book, and that was put a tariff on high carbon emitters. Because one of the things we do is we offsource our high polluting industries into China, and they are much less efficient at producing GDP than we are. And so it makes the problem worse. But if we were to say, look, we are going to put a carbon emissions tariff on you, and so the goods that you buy are going to cost a little bit more if you ship them into the U.S., that might have an impact. But still, there is no sign that there's any abatement in their growing carbon emissions. So I'm skeptical that we have anything short of war to get a handle on that. So last two slides. What's ahead? So there are a group of people that are very idealistic who believe that technology is going to solve our problems, and that really the reason that we're hooked on oil and coal is because of the oil and coal industry. And they really don't appreciate the reasons that we're actually addicted to these things, as they're so convenient relative to green energy. You know, it probably will. Our green economy is going to create lots of jobs because, as I said, as you move down on energy return on energy invested, it takes more effort and more people. So one claim from the green people is it creates a lot more jobs. It does. It takes a lot more people to produce a BTU of ethanol than it does a BTU of oil or a BTU of any other source. So here's the idealistic future. There are a group of us that hope that if we beat the podium long enough that people will make the changes, some of the changes that we need to make. I guess most of us here are in that group. We believe that if we talk about it and if we write about it and if we educate people, we will go in a better direction here. But then I also want to know, given my meager influence over what's going to happen, what really is likely to happen? What is the likely outcome? And I believe that what's going to happen is a lot of the green delusion are coming to an end, and that's happening now. We're seeing some of the green tech companies go bankrupt as the money dries up. I think we'll see fossil fuels and nuclear continue to provide the bulk of global electricity. The accident in Japan is going to stall that in Europe a little bit. It may stall it in the U.S. a little bit. It's not going to slow China down at all. They're going to continue to build nuclear plants as fast as they can. I think crude oil will continue to provide the bulk of our fuels, albeit at ever-increasing prices. We're going to see dirtier fuel. I mean, we're going to see tar sands. We're going to see palm oil. We're going to see coal to liquids, and we're going to see more greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to have very difficult food versus fuel debates as we use more arable land to produce fuel. And then we're going to be slowly strangled to death at the expense of OPEC is going to just siphon the money out of us as we continue to hope that there's a solution around the corner, and we continue to look to our political leaders for a solution. You know, oil is $100 a barrel today. Brent is, but we're in that range. We're almost an order of magnitude higher than we were 10 years ago. What have our political leaders done to resolve that? Nothing. I mean, all that money is like a hidden tax weighting down the economy, and I think that's what's going to continue to happen. And I think that was the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.